Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another day of invertebrate zoology. This officially is the tipping point where we move away from inverts and into a lot of what you're probably much more familiar um, with true vertebrates. We do have to acknowledge chondrichthyes here because they really are a um, transitional state between invertebrate life and vertebrate life in regard to their skeletons. Uh, the chondrichthyes are our cartilaginous fish, so they don't have a true skeleton with calcium ossified bones. Uh, but we do have the notochord, meaning the spinal cord, and everything else that traditionally makes up a vertebrate. We just have to acknowledge this weird transitory state. Anything past chondrichthyes here, and we've already talked agnatha, which are the real kind of missing link between invertebrate and vertebrate life. Here's our next step up, but like you can officially put the stamp on anything after this class cannot be taught as invertebrates. This is the end of the line, and even this is stretching it a little bit, but still important to acknowledge chondrichthyes' presence. The cartilaginous makeup allows for uh, a couple cool things to occur. Flexibility, dealing with crazy depths, just to name a few, but it does have some drawbacks. Not having true bones in a skeleton certainly provides a challenge. Another one of these weird things that are out there, you can see on your screen, it's obviously a skate or a ray. A lot of people assume that these are there's huge differences maybe between a shark and a ray. No, sharks and rays are almost the exact same animal. They've just been flattened out. It's difficult for our brains to process, but almost everything else going on with skates, rays, and sharks are all in line with one another. Uh, all chondrichthyes, all cartilaginous skeletons. The ones at the bottom will be possessing a spiracle. Yeah, there's a ton that goes hand in hand, but we will learn about them separately, of course, because that's much easier to break down and process versus here's everything about sharks, here's everything about rays. We'll get started with rays um, and move our way forward, but realize that these animals are 100% in the same group, in the same niche. They are all classified as chondrichthyes, so we do have to study them the same. The big leap here, I guess, is the fact that we now have jaws. I know that seems kind of trivial at this point, but when you're talking invertebrates, uh, jawed vertebrates now take the role. They kind of pass the torch going forward. We talked about chelicerates, meaning we don't have mandibles yet. Even the mandibulates, which make up all your insects, don't technically have jaws. Here we have a jawed vertebrae. Uh, Agnatha is like I said, the transitory missing link, so to speak, where we have a jawless, air quotes, vertebrae. Um, and that's mostly hagfish, not so much the lampreys. But hagfish really are that missing link as far as evolution, and they're still around today, which allows us the opportunity to study chondrichthyes as part of either invertebrates. I mean, technically, we could be studying them as far as vertebrates or as far as fish. They fit into a lot of little niche areas, but I'm lucky enough we get to talk about them here. So, chondrichthyes. Uh, First off, as we look at this image, uh, because you have a cartilaginous skeleton, you know that a true bone clone would be really hard to come by. Um, it's cartilage, it's not bone. So you're not going to get a ton of skeletal evidence. But one thing that you should note very easily, having your vast experience in the zoo program, there's one very key thing that's obviously missing from this image. The absence of, anybody got a guess as what's missing? Ribs, right? Ribs, yes, exactly. That's a pretty noticeable exception to the typical skeleton we see. There's absolutely no ribs. And this really comes into play uh, based off both how we can keep these animals in captivity and how their buoyancy is affected in water. So let's start off at the beginning. Uh, as the animal is developing, we have a notochord, which again, I know we've mentioned it, but I'm going to review it just really quick. Uh, the notochord is the scientific evolutionary term for the spinal cord, but I don't want you to think of the spine as what's important. Obviously, we like our spines, it helps us stand up, things like that. Uh, the importance of the spinal cord, though, is that it's hollow. It allows all the nerve endings, almost like a conduit with cable running through it. Um, it allows the spinal column to act as the central nervous system and have a complex network running through the entire body. Uh, in this case, the start of the notochord, aka the spinal column, aka this conduit, um, shows up when they're developing, but then transitions to cartilage uh, instead of ossified bone. This process as a whole is called chondrification. It's what obviously gives these animals their namesake as chondrichthyes. Um, all of what should be a skeleton transitions into a cartilaginous skeleton and not true bone. With that, again, these animals have been doing it a very long time. Um, Sharks have been around longer than trees. It's clearly a model that works really well, but does have its drawbacks. Really, the drawbacks though are more suited to how we can handle them in captivity and things like that. They're going to lack ribs, which means that their body form is very efficient in the water. Out of water, now we're starting to hit some problems. Uh, as you look at the image on your screen, you've got a picture, and maybe this is going too far back in history. If any of you have seen the movie Free Willy, where they move via crane a large orca whale, they're able to basically create a hammock. They put the whale in it, and they're able to move him back and forth. With a shark or a very large bodied chondrichthyes, uh, because you lack ribs, the second you're taken out of water, your own weight starts to crush you. There's not a support structure in place. Um, this would be like, and again, it's difficult, but you guys all understand buoyancy and how it works in water. But picture you as a human not having ribs and trying to sleep on your stomach. Uh, your own weight and mass would fall on your internal organs. You'd be crushing yourself. And this is the problem that we run into with chondrichthyes. It's what adds to a lot of the challenges with keeping them in captivity. It's very difficult to move them. The initial transfer that takes place to get them from, let's say, ocean to aquarium is very, very challenging because they almost need a static, buoyancy favoring environment around them all the time. With the lack of ribs, you just lack the, I guess, structural integrity to not collapse in on yourself like a dying star. Uh, but as far as advantages, uh, you've got a almost unparalleled advantage when it comes to eating and processing food. You're not limited by ribs. So we've done the negatives. Now here are the positives. It means as a, let's say, a great white shark, for example, uh, you can go from not eating to swallowing huge chunks of seal, whale, fish, whatever you're going for. Um, and you're not limited anymore as to how big of a bite you're tearing off. Anything that can get through the mouth and the jaws themselves can easily transfer down the esophagus, and you're not limited anymore with that pesky old rib cage that a lot of animals have to deal with. So advantages and disadvantages. Um, like I said, the disadvantages really come from the captivity side and how we can mitigate their husbandry. Without us being involved, though, it's a perfect body plan. It's You're using your own environment to uphold your form. The water and salinity are providing all the buoyancy advantages you need, and you've gotten rid of really an unnecessary design with the ribs, the sternum, the rib cage, things like that. So very, very efficient. It just affects us as far as how we can care for these animals. We've got a few differences here too. When it comes to internal anatomy, one of the things a lot of people forget, if we're missing a skeleton, and again, these animals do have a skeleton, it's just made out of cartilage. But if we're missing true, what you would all consider bones, we're also missing bone marrow. And bone marrow is where we're going to get red blood cells produced. Obviously, we need red, whites, blood cells all over the place, all sorts of things happening. We just have to move that manufacturing outside of the skeleton. So we've moved it into the spleen. There's quite a few animals actually that will produce it in the gonadal tissue area as well. But that's one of the kind of overlooked parts of not having a skeleton, is where your red and white blood cells are going to come from. The spleen picks up the slack for a lot of these animals. One of the things I want you to see in the image on the side of your screen here, this is one of the weird years where we weren't able to do this in class. Usually we can have a dissection period for these animals. I can't tell you, and it's nice that we're all online now because nobody has to come right out and say it. Almost every year when we do a dissection, as you start labeling parts of the body, almost everyone says, get my pencil out, these are the lungs. No, we're talking fish. There's not lungs. They look exactly like what would be lungs in the human body or a mammal body, but this is your liver. We're not talking fish in this class because we're just focused on the invertebrates up to this point. Fish have what's called a swim bladder. That's how they're going to be able to adjust their buoyancy. Chondrichthyes have very large livers. This is how they're able to adjust their height, if you will, or depth in the water column. The liver takes up a huge, I'm talking like, looks unnatural, looks almost painful, amount of the body cavity, because they're going to use their oily liver. That's what's going to help them adjust their buoyancy and depth as they swim or traverse the open seas. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head. Are sharks' blood cells nucleated? Not that it matters too much, especially pertaining to the class, I guess. But yeah, I just wondered that. Like reptiles and birds have nucleated blood cells, which are more efficient in the aspect of providing that energy elsewhere in the body systems, whereas they're not producing white blood cells on the well, so you know what I mean. You know where I'm going with this, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's fantastic and a great opportunity, especially given where the, I guess, zoo program would take you with all your non-mammalian vertebrates. Shark blood cells are, the red blood cells are nucleated, so they have the genetic material there. I guess without getting too far down a bio course, it's a really good question. I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain it using what will show up on exams and stuff for this class. The method in which oxygen and carbon dioxide and stuff is a little bit different because the animal has gills as opposed to lungs. So hemoglobin plays a big role in that. But yeah, for the most part, yes, to answer just the question without me going off on a tangent, nucleated. And so the blood cells are going to possess a lot of the genetic material the animal would need. Hopefully it's a great question. Yeah, and without, I could pull up another slide if you guys like, and we can go down the rabbit hole of animal biology and cellular biology and all that cool stuff. Really fascinating. adaptations going on. It's definitely worth looking into, especially those of you that want to go into the maybe wildlife biologist route. Please take that question and do your own research and start digging. It really is fascinating and cool, but kind of takes on a new life of its own when we start doing another lecture on that.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
What is the difference between a gill slit and a gill ray?
Yeah, rays typically are applied when we have what's called an operculum. We'll see a picture of it in a little bit. It's the difference between, I guess, having almost let's consider a gill slit, like a unsupported kind of flap, where the water is able to passively move through. Your gill rays typically have some cartilage behind them, so they're bigger and able to move a little better. Let's use like an airplane as an example. Picture your airplane if you have like a window seat and you're by the wings. As you're starting to land or descent or ascend even, you'll see the flaps on the wing move. That would be a gill ray, whereas a gill slit would just basically allow the current to take it wherever it's going. It would adjust based off the environment around it. The external openings are always referred to as gill slits. It's just whether or not there's a cartilaginous presence there to kind of stiffen and add some structure to the gill itself. They're both going to function the same way. It's just one has some rigidity to it, whereas the other just passively sits there and moves water through it, if that makes sense. We're going to see this come, and the reason that's important, I'm glad that question was asked, we're going to typically see gill rays in larger bodied species. We're going to see gill slits with usually smaller, and not so much smaller, but certainly more benthic dwelling species, so animals that passively lay at the bottom of the ocean, where you can allow water to move around you. As we get bigger and larger, we're going to need some rigidity and structure to the gills themselves. But excellent question. One of the things, since that question was asked, we should probably note on here, is the spiracle. This is going to play a big role with respiration as well. Before we get into respiration, the questions have been awesome. Keep them coming. And I apologize that the PowerPoint is going out of order from what you guys are asking. I promise I'll get to it in just a second here. But yeah, awesome. Before we get to respiration, let's touch on scales real quick. I guess touch on scales is not the right thing to say. You don't really want to touch these animal scales. We have what are called placoid scales. Denticles is another word you might hear. It's the structure of the scale themselves. This is obviously a enlarged image of how all Chondrichthyes skin looks. And it winds up being a really interesting evolutionary adaptation. And it comes with quite a few caveats as far as how they're managed in captivity. Hopefully, a lot of you have had the opportunity to go to an aquarium, and in a touch tank, obviously there's not sharks, but a lot of the times there's rays, which again are just pancake versions of sharks. If you've had the opportunity to engage with like a stingray at an aquarium, the one thing that they'll tell you when you go up to interact with the animal is you want to move your hands in only one direction. And it's because of the denticles or placoid scales. The structure and design of them is very, very much sandpaper-like, except it's only in one direction. What I mean is let's say this is the ray that you're engaging with. If I take the back of my hand and go this direction, the animal feels smooth, almost slimy, very easy interaction. If, however, I take my hand and use it in the alternate pattern or alternate direction, all of a sudden that ray is going to carve your hand up just from its skin alone. The orientation of all the placoid scales is designed to be extremely abrasive and rough if you move in the wrong direction. Sandpaper is probably not even a fair assessment. There's been a lot of instances where people think that they've been bitten by a shark before, and it's literally because their leg, for example, their leg moved in the opposite direction that the shark was. There's been a lot of kind of false bites attributed to their skin. With this, there's been some debate back and forth, but we've pretty much settled on a conclusion now. The debate was between whether or not the placoid scales migrated to the mouth, or whether the teeth migrated out onto the skin. Because basically they're the exact same composition and design. The general, again, kind of accepted idea out there now is that they've developed this extremely abrasive, rough skin, and it basically migrated to the mouth and became the dentition pattern. We've got constantly replaceable, very sharp teeth that really evolved from the skin itself. And if you, let me get all these arrows off your screen. If you picture that iconic image of like a great white shark coming up and biting something, and you've got those rows and rows of teeth, you can actually see it in motion right here through the skin. The skin migrated and just got enlarged and replaced the regular fish dentition. But exact same design, they just have it all over their body. So sharks are quite literally covered in their own teeth, and the placoid scales are evidence of that. All right, good. We didn't have to wait too long until we got into respiration. This is kind of one of those folklore or old wives' tales. It's been around for a long time that sharks have to use what we call ram ventilation. Ram ventilation means that the animal has to move. They don't have, let's see if I can draw this as best I can here. You guys know how great my drawings are. If you picture a goldfish, you've got that, like if I told everybody at home to make a fishy face right now, you'd put your hands up by your cheeks and start kind of flapping them. That's because that would be the animal's operculum. Operculum's a hard-bodied piece of the tissue that opens and shuts basically to start moving water through the gills. When you have an animal like this, you don't have that ability to move water by yourself. So you're going to have to be constantly moving in order to get that flow of water. Does that make sense to everybody? And for a long time, we thought that sharks had to keep moving in order to keep breathing. That's definitely not the case. It is for some, and we'll highlight them as we go. But we do have gills, and ram ventilation, while it is present, isn't the exclusive and only way that sharks are able to breathe. Here's a very strange but very accurate diagram. You basically swim with your mouth open. And instead of having that operculum here at the gills, again, so instead of having an air intake or water intake, I guess in this case, the animal swims with its mouth open and allows oxygen-rich water to pass through the gill slits. Again, I know I've said this a bunch already, but we'll say it one last time. Anytime you're able to passively take on dissolved oxygen, you're of course able to transfer out waste gas, meaning not only are you able to expel carbon, you're also able to expel things like nitrogenous compounds, basically the equivalent of, I guess the mammalian equivalent would be urination. So a lot of toxins in the blood are able to go out via the gill slits while you're bringing on nothing but dissolved oxygen from the water around you. One of the kind of strange phenoms here, I guess, is with this ram ventilation. And this is, every time I say it, and I've said it for years, but it's still weird to me to say it every time. One of the most important things you need to be noting is not only are they allowing their mouths to be open and transfer that oxygen through the gills, they're also drinking water constantly. The biggest risk you have as an oceanic animal is dehydration. And that always seems to confuse people and not make sense right away. you got to picture salinity wise, the ocean is constantly draining you and leaching you of the water in your body. Sharks have to drink maybe more than any animal on Earth. They're constantly drinking water, filtering out the salt so their bodies stay well hydrated. So there's a lot going on here outside of just respiration. You're getting dissolved oxygen, you're removing waste pathogens from your body, and you're just drinking water in order to stay hydrated. And filtering out salt. There's a lot going on here that much more than meets the eye. But as we found out with ram ventilation and the truth behind it, the animal doesn't have to be constantly swimming to do it. Uh, there's a lot, and especially since we're talking about rays too, rays aren't constantly swimming. Um, and so we're going to figure out the advantages and how animals have been able to adapt to that. That comes up right here. This is your spiracle. If the animal is benthic, and usually, I'd say most of the time, benthic dwelling usually implies that you're kind of a sit and wait predator. Not always the case with rays. Uh, Rays are much more about sitting, and once they have something in their visual range, they can go out and hunt, if that makes sense. So you're not quite an ambush predator, but you are a sit and wait animal. Anything that's benthic and bottom dwelling is almost always going to have a spiracle. This basically makes up for what ram ventilation would do. It provides you a way to force water in and out of the body. Think of it almost like a back of the tank power filter. The water's not going to filter itself. So all your animals that are benthic have developed a spiracle. It looks like an ear slit, basically right behind the eye. And it's where you're able to force water in through the gills without having to swim around. Obviously, this animal right here, ideal scenario is to cover yourself in sand, sit there, wait till you see a crab or a fish come by. Then afterwards, you can go out and actively predate. But you don't want to be swimming around if you want to be an ambush predator. You want to be camouflaged, possibly submerged in the substrate. And so the spiracle has become the, water filtration pump to keep that flow of water going without having to actually physically move. Very, very effective. And this alone is what has dispelled all the rumors or all the previous thoughts of ram ventilation. All right, this is where things get crazy. So if you've got questions, ask them. When it comes to reproduction, Chondrichthyes exhibit maybe the most diverse setup as far as how they're able to reproduce. It's and again, it really depends on your background and what animals you've studied so far. If you're familiar with mammal reproduction, like sorry, not sorry, it's going to get wild. Mammals are boring. Here we're going to have like the most extreme scenarios play themselves out. These animals again have been around forever, and so of course they have a very wide array of reproductive options in their arsenal. We're going to see a lot of interesting, some horrifying, some very weird, strange things are about to occur. But again, this is what a lot of the animal kingdom looks like. You've just got to break outside of that mammal box that we're all very familiar with. Yeah, things are going to take a very interesting turn here. So we're going to talk about a couple terms. A lot of them you might be familiar with just on the surface, but we're going to clarify all the gray area, hopefully, and make sure you guys are feeling confident in the reproductive lifestyles for these animals. Because again, a lot of these terms have been used, but maybe used improperly. When it comes to the development on the surface, and again, this is like as easy as it's going to get, you either lay eggs or you have live birth. That's the layman's version of this. There's going to be a lot more going on for every single stage of development, but we're starting off easy. When it comes to eggs, If they are, so eggs mean you have external birth, internal fertilization no matter what, so actual copulation. But if you're going to lay eggs, and now that the eggs are fertilized, you turn into an oviparous animal. Mermaid's purse is the name applied to a lot of the eggs of Chondrichthyes. They're going to really vary with shape, size, location, and all of it's directly tied to how the animals lay their eggs. If the mermaid's purse looks more like this, it's designed to usually hold on to kelp, plant life. It's basically just that the animal doesn't become completely free swimming in its embryonic form. In the top left of your screen, animals like that are usually laid and then allowed to disperse throughout the ocean while in their larval form. On the bottom or middle right, I guess, anytime we see that kind of corkscrew design, those typically are designed to entangle themselves and ensnare themselves in whether it's substrate or plant life so that they stay put. They're all designed with their own very specific purposes, but they're all externalized eggs. This makes you an oviparous animal. And again, oviparous is a term that you've probably heard. If you're leaning towards reptiles or birds, of course, we're going to talk oviparity there. But this is your easy one. We're starting off easy. Oviparous or oviparity means after the animal's reproduced, it will lay eggs, whether they extrude them or actually lay them. Again, we're not really going to have nest sites so much with Chondrichthyes, but certainly when we move to birds and reptiles, we'll have some nesting behaviors going on. For the sake of what we're talking about, if you're going to lay eggs, you typically have an area you lay them in, but you haven't exactly developed a nest site. You're going to go to somewhere either densely populated with plant life or literally just lay eggs out into the ocean. So it really depends, but we're not typically having a nesting behavior. The important part about oviparity is that's where we're laying eggs. And again, this is as easy as it's going to get because now we move on to my least favorite term in zoology, and it's on its way out, thankfully. But I have to kick it while it's down right here because it is a terrible, terrible term. And this is ovoviviparity. Not only is it hard to spell, tricky to say, it's also completely inaccurate. With ovoviviparity, it's the appearance of live birth, meaning baby emerges from the adult female alive and kicking, but we don't know how it gets to that stage. The previous definitions of this went along the lines of the female hatches the eggs inside of her. That was kind of the common speak for this a long time ago. That in itself is very confusing. First off, you got to understand there's no way it makes sense to develop eggs, shell your eggs, allow them to crack and hatch inside of you. So that's definitely not the case. What we have to look at is instead of this terrible term of ovoviviparity, again, if you ever hear this, I fully support you calling somebody out in public about this. I'll have your back. You can FaceTime me and I'll jump in and have your back. Yeah, ovoviviparity, not a word. Call it aplacental connection. That makes a lot more sense. And what we're able to do from there is talk about the fact that you're deriving nutrients from just the yolk of the egg. It's not a true egg. You're not shelled. That makes no sense. But it happens quite a bit in Chondrichthyes. Basically, what's happening is you copulate, offspring are fertilized, and as they develop just like they're in an egg, but they're free swimming almost in the placental cavity for these animals. They still have and again, I don't know a better way to describe this. It looks just like they're in an egg, but they're not shelled. You've still got that yolk attached to, I guess, it's weird to think of sharks with belly buttons, but no, that's pretty much what it is. The animals are basically encapsulated inside the female's body, but are living their lives just like they're still developing an egg. This allows the female to obviously provide protection. It allows insurance that the embryos are going to develop much better than being free swimming or just dumped out to sea. But all they're doing is absorbing that egg yolk, developing, and then once that egg yolk's depleted, the female releases the, again, kind of live born offspring. And so while, yes, they're born live, they've been doing nothing but, I guess, living inside of a fake egg. And I know this is maybe a little confusing for some of you. It's definitely outside the norm of what we would think of with mammal reproduction, but ovoviviparity is much better described as aplacental connection. Aplacental, of course, meaning without a placental connection. And through this, you have the appearance of live birth, but there's no deriving of nutrients from the mother. And I guess that's the important point to think of too. If the animal is exhibiting ovoviviparity, it means that the embryo developing inside them has relied on just the egg yolk. It means basically that they were eggs, just not shelled. We switch things over when we get to viviparity or placental viviparity, and there's a lot to dissect there as well.
Can I ask a quick question about
Absolutely.
that? Is the yolk just like, I don't know how to phrase this. Is it just like floating around, or does it hold some sort of form?
It does. Let me see actually if we can get to, that's a pretty good image right there. This is a little bit different, and we're going to jump to this in a second. But basically, it looks like an umbilical cord with quite literally an egg yolk attached to it. Let's see if I can find any better image on here. Nope. We're gonna have to stick with this for now. It looks like a umbilical cord off a newborn with a true. Having seen them, it looks just like an egg yolk. It's just the animal's not in the shell. Excellent question, and hopefully, as we go through a couple more of these, it'll make a little more sense. But yeah, it quite literally looks like an animal that's been unshelled. They have some degree of movement and they swim around inside of the female. But the importance again is the whole time all they're doing is absorbing that yolk into their body. When the offspring are born, and again, this is why ovoviviparity is terrible, because you wouldn't know one way or the other typically once the animal's born. The yolk's been absorbed, that quote unquote umbilical cord is kind of disconnected. So the animal looks like it's having live birth. Without science and, of course, where our technology has gotten us, you don't know what's been occurring inside this animal. And this brings us to viviparity. We've already gotten weird, right? We've already gone from laying eggs to now appearance of live birth, but the eggs hatching inside the female. And now the one thing that you thought you could rely on, because it's very mammal-centered, viviparity, now we got to throw some asterisks up on this one too. Viviparity is not what it seems either. Viviparity is live birth. However, we're going to have a new caveat, and like I said, kind of a new asterisk attached to viviparity here. It's whenever the embryo is going to derive nutrients from the mother outside of just that egg yolk. So ovoviviparity, again, let's never say that again, aplacental connection means that the animals are surviving off the yolk inside the female, and then they're released and born, hatched, whatever you want to call it. But the entire time they've been deriving nutrients like they were in an egg. Here we have viviparity, where if we're looking at it on the surface, it simply means that the mother is providing nutrients outside of just the yolk. With placental viviparity, this is the one that everybody's familiar with. It's how we're all here. It's a very mammal-centric idea that has now developed into so much more as we've learned more about the animals in our world. Placental, this is where, again, we have that umbilical cord, and I have 2 kids, so I feel like I can say this. I've never been pregnant, but I feel like I can have some authority to talk about them. It's literally like having an internal parasite, basically. Um, it's literally leaching nutrients from mom. And obviously, they turn out cute usually. Uh, Lots of people like them. Lots of people have had them. But that's the essential idea here. Is and again, I know it sounds weird to say that babies are parasitizing mom, but that's exactly what they're doing. They're tied directly to the bloodstream. Um, they're taking on nutrients, eating what you eat. It's I'm sorry, but it's parasitism. It's leaching nutrients. It's okay. It's okay. My kids are outside playing. I can hear them, so they're not hearing this conversation. But uh, this is where we thought viviparity kind of stopped and ended with the placental connection, the tying into mom's digestive tract, bloodstream, oxygen, all that stuff. And for a long time, we just assumed that that was the only kind of live birth that would happen. As we've developed our understanding of both humans and the animal world, if you're taking anything from mom outside of just that egg yolk, it's a form of viviparity. We just had to come up with new names for it. That's where hemotrophic viviparity comes from. Basically, this is a 50-50 split, the best of both worlds. The offspring, and you can see evolution-wise how all this came to be, and it's really, really cool. That's why Chondrichthyes offer such a great insight into all the reproduction forms in the animal world. We have a placental connection. Again, the animal cruising around, the question was asked earlier, with this umbilical cord attached to a yolk. Then we have the next step up where we have animals that once the yolk is absorbed, what used to be basically the yolk sac attaches to the wall of the female and becomes a modified placenta. So again, it's a cool snapshot of the evolution of reproductive styles. Here we have both what started as aplacental connection or ovoviviparity, and then moves to hemotrophic viviparity, because once the yolk is moved on or absorbed, the animal is able to still attach to the female, and now it's a placenta. And that's honestly the truth. I feel like humans, we were pretty proud of placentas, like live birth. That's kind of our thing, like step off sharks, but they're able to do it too. Um, there's a lot going on here. Again, I'm trying to make this very complicated topic as simple as possible. But there's a lot going on as far as what we can learn evolution wise. So many cool, unique traits and details, and something that frankly we were very naive about and very, I guess, kind of cocky about how cool mammals are and how we reproduce. Uh, Sharks have been doing it differently and more efficiently for a lot longer. And hemotrophic viviparity is just one of their options that they've come up with. The modified placenta here is the important part. Again, as far as studying and exam stuff, really dive into this. The simple version is if you're deriving nutrients in any way, shape, or form outside of the yolk, you're exhibiting viviparity. If the offspring is getting nutrients from mom outside of that initial yolking process, or vitellogenesis, as it's called, you are 100% a viviparous animal. It just depends on what kind of prefix you have onto that. Hemotrophic viviparity, all sorts of crazy stuff is going to come up too. Yeah, it's confusing because we're so locked into that idea of how mammals operate. This is definitely not the case. And video links I'll post as the video comes up. We're not going to watch them here. With histotrophic viviparity, this is where things get interesting. And I think this is the coolest, maybe, reproductive style out there. I feel pretty honored I get to talk about all sorts of weird animals, from the pipa pipa, which is a frog in South America that hatches its babies out of its back. That's one of my faves. But I kind of have to tip my hat here. to this form of viviparity. I don't think you can get any more savage, or like survival of the fittest comes to mind. This is the ultimate survival of the fittest. And this is where we have embryonic development and then the production of either unfertilized eggs or siblings. And we move into oophagy or adelphophagy. This is when you're having intrauterine cannibalism. Adelphophagy literally translates as eating one's brother. And what we have is a scenario that plays out where you have, and usually sand tigers are the best example. Like I said, I'll post this video link for you guys to check out. It goes where no camera should have ever gone before. Inside the uterine lining of a sand tiger shark, and you have usually about 8 to 12 offspring born at the same time. They absorb their yolk, and whichever one is the strongest and the fastest starts eating all of its siblings inside of the female. So, I mean, with humans, you hear about like twins and one absorbs the other. It's not that uncommon, actually. That's about as extreme as it gets with humans. With sand tiger sharks and animals that exhibit hystertrophic viviparity, you have intrauterine cannibalism. So you want to think about this in a couple ways. First, it's pretty BA. Like that's getting after it. That's about as savage as it comes. But let's also take into consideration what this really means. Your animals are typically going to give birth to one offspring. It sounds mean, but it's kind of important you are sure that this animal is going to be like survive and be like well trained at the gym. It takes an incredible nutrient devotion. The females produced, again, 8, 10, 12, who knows, amount of offspring. The entire time, too, she's going to produce unfertilized eggs that enter that horrifying death trap of a placenta now, where there's one shark that's grown strong enough, eaten all its siblings, and will continue to consume eggs. It's like a giant death broth that the animal lives in. It sounds really barbaric, but it's very logical. You've literally already weeded out the weak ones, and you're ensuring that whatever one offspring you give birth to is the strongest. It's destroyed all its siblings. There's no chance of risking things like a deformity. Like, we love you, Nemo, but that little fin, that's not going to fly with sharks. You're going to have the best of the best. They've eaten all the others. And you're providing food the entire time by serving up a weird, gross, over easy egg system that you just constantly pump in. It truly is like a horrifying but unique look into, again, survival of the fittest, only the strong survive, whatever cliche thing you want to bring up. Really, really cool when it comes to adelphophagy, as horrifying as it is. And like I said, the entire time, these animals are swimming around in like this soupy broth of their cannibalized siblings and unfertilized eggs from the female. When they're born, like, they're ready. There's not a lot of teaching moments that have to occur. It sounds painful and scary, but man, it's efficient, and it really shows the evolutionary steps needed to get to hystertrophic viviparity. Man, I'm almost just in awe of it. It's terrifying, but man, it really highlights evolution and what's important, and that's ensuring that your offspring have the best chance possible to survive. And this one starts in utero. So really tragic for the others, but the one that comes out, man, like, good for you. You did work in there. So yeah, very outside of the norm, but definitely an important highlight for Chondrichthyes reproduction. Now that we've moved past reproductive styles, let's get into the classification of these two animals. We've got two groups, the elasmobranchs and the holocephalans. Chimeras are the ones we're going to start off with because chimera forms are very strange and overlooked and not nearly as well studied. Elasmobranchs has everything else. Sharks, rays, skates, sawfish, guitarfish, you name it. The holocephalans are definitely the outliers, and the only reason for that is we've got an animal that's, first off, kind of goofy looking. Second off, lives very deep down in the ocean typically. And third off, nobody has the money to study them. So they get lumped together, the chimeras in general, into kind of what we call a wastebasket taxa, where, hey, it looks weird, let's dump it into this classification. Hopefully, this inspires all of you to go out and study holocephalans, and maybe you can send me a postcard once the taxonomy has been brought up to date, because there's a lot of interesting things with them. I'm just confused as to why we haven't studied them more. So if your dream is to be a marine biologist, let me nudge you in the direction of looking into holocephalans. The holocephali translates directly as complete head. Within that group, the order Chimeriformes is the only group still extant or still living today. They basically get named after whatever terrestrial vertebrate they look most like. They're, I don't know how to describe it. I actually like them. They're like that, oh, it's so ugly, it's cute type animal. But there is a lot going on with them that I can't for the life of me peg why we haven't studied them a little bit more. They look like a very unique opportunity to understand evolutionary history. But yeah, you've got a deep sea animal that's certainly not going to get its own Shark Week because they look like this. Aw, like how could you not love that face? Oh, there we go. Another highlight reel. These are all the glamour shots of chimeriforms. This is as good as it gets for these animals. There's our elephant fish. They're not super impressive. And because of that, they've been overlooked in taxonomy and evolutionary history. What we do know, though, I think personally, says a lot about how far these animals have come and their uniqueness and their branching off from the regular evolutionary lifestyle. Sorry for all the clicking. The gut is beyond simplified. They basically have dental plates with this whole head. It's all almost a solid piece. They go around and usually feed on mollusks or invertebrates, anything they can crunch and swallow. They're not going to obviously tackle like big prey. The stomach and intestine have been merged on these animals, so they lack a true stomach. The other big difference, I guess there's two. First one, obviously, right here that's highlighted. This is actually really unique. It's not something everybody wants to brag about, but that's a huge deal. Separate anal and urogenital openings. I mean, you guys hopefully know up to this point, when you're dealing with inverts all the way up through birds, you're almost always talking about a cloaca, a urogenital tract opening with the vent that allows the animal to reproduce and defecate, urinate, whatever is going on. To have a branch and a deviation from that so early in evolutionary history is, I think, really noteworthy. Again, they don't want to go around with a pen that says like, hey, I have separate anal and urogenital openings. It's not something you write in the yearbook or you want on your tombstone type thing. But evolution wise, it really is pretty astounding that there's an animal out there that seems to cross this plane that isn't crossed until birds, and that we wouldn't really know much else about it. So definitely some unique traits with these animals. Just a shame we don't know more about them. Again, the upper jaw has been fused with the cranium, so this is one piece. There's no articulation here. You basically have what we call a dental plate, which is just like it sounds. two rigid surfaces that very clumsily orient themselves and can crush, and that's about it. There's not a lot of articulation or craniokinesis going on here. This brings us up to what's happened quite a bit. We've been a lot better about it, but this puts them in the group of what we call wastebasket taxa. And to be clear, this isn't just because the animal's fish or an invert. This has happened with all sorts of animals, including mammals. Any of you that want to work with hoofstock, you've probably heard of the terms Parasidactyla or Artiodactyla. All the dactylas used to be thrown together. It was animals with hooves or toes. Um, it wasn't until we went back in and did our research that we separated it between even-toed and even and odd-toed ungulates. Um, Before that, it was just a bunch of dactylas. So it does happen all the time. It's nice to see when science goes back in and reorganizes everything, because it means we're at least giving crap and looking into something. Of course, the downside is that you have to learn all new taxonomical hierarchy. You have all sorts of new Latin thrown your way, but it needs to be done, and it should be done more often, especially with chimeriforms. Uh, Chimeriforms is the poster child now for wastebasket taxa. It's, hey, this animal's weird, it's a chimeriform. That's clearly doing a disservice to science, to you as zoo students, and to all chondrichthyes in general. So with chimeriforms out of the way, we get to move into chondrichthyes. A lot of them are benthic, meaning they live at the bottom. Uh, we call it inferior mouth placement, meaning on the underside or pointing down. Obviously, all the sharks, for the most part, that you want to get on your highlight reel, those are the big ones, but they're few and far between. You got to figure a lot of the skates and rays all are on the bottom. The notable exceptions, I guess, all have to do, if you think back a million years ago to our first lecture, our biggest species of all chondrichthyes aren't the cool great white giant super predators. They're very peaceful platonic filter feeders. Think about it, like you go back to the energy transfer that we talked about and the rule of 10% and how it's broken in the ocean, how zooplankton and phytoplankton initially transfer and switch off that 40% energy exchange. It's no mistake or no accident that your largest skates, your largest rays, and your largest sharks are all feeding at the very bottom of the food chain. Uh, your biggest shark, whale shark, your biggest ray, manta ray. There's logic behind it when you go back to that energy flow and how food transfers up the chain. You want to be eating at the bottom of the food chain. And the biggest animals in our environment, blue whales included, all feed at that very, very bottom tier. You don't want to be high up. So biggest differences between skates and rays. Easily has to do with their birthing method of, and while I say that it's the easiest way to detect that, obviously it's not the easiest. You'd have to see this animal giving birth. But this is our most notable difference. So don't use this as a identification tool out in the field. If you're out scuba diving, because you're on a super cool vacation, please don't stick around underwater until you see these animals give birth to know whether it's a skate or a ray. There's other differences, but biologically, this is the easiest way to discern one from the other. With rays, we have ovoviviparity, blah, aplacental viviparity. Let's stick with that. So we have that appearance of live birth. The entire time inside the female ray, though, the egg or the embryos are living off nothing but that egg yolk. So they're hatched, born, whatever term you want to use, without deriving nutrients from mom. With skates, this is where we get all the intricately designed mermaid's purses. The oviparous species are all skates. All your rays have the appearance of live birth, but it's just not shelling that egg or going through the process. The group here is relatively easy as far as the taxonomy to follow. Rays, of course, having a lot more variety and honestly more studying gone into it due to their presence in aquaria. Myliobatiforms are the most notable. Topredeniforms, really cool. And then under skates, we just have the rayiforms. This is one of those, like, what is it called? Like facepalm moments where you've just got to wonder what scientists are thinking. As you go back in and start identifying all of the skates and rays, why you would leave rayiforms as the only group of skates, not the rays, is beyond me. But it keeps things interesting. Certainly allows me to rant about it. So hopefully that repetition sinks in. But yeah, your rayiforms are all the skates, and then all the other words that don't sound anything like rays are all your rays. We're going to go over them pretty quickly. Myliobatiforms are a weird group just based off the individuals here. Torpediniforms, probably not as present in most facilities. I've seen, I think, 2 in my entire life. These are your electric animals. Super interesting, definitely quite the challenge. But yeah, just not going to be a day-to-day animal you typically work with. And then the pristiforms, we'll talk about them too. They're more numerous, certainly, than the electric animals, but it takes a very unique setup for these animals to be properly cared for. We'll probably wind up coming back to this image. It's important to note a couple things about the image on the right hand of your screen. Obviously, the most important thing is how goofy their faces look. They do kind of look like they're smiling. If you've ever seen a ray up against the glass where you can see the underside, it looks like it's got a cartoonish face attached to it. All that's very fun and good. But one of the other things we're looking at is the very noticeable gill slits. This really comes into play if we take aside, like, set aside the cartoonishness of the animal. If we look from this angle, sorry, I guess I should have the pen out. If we look from this angle, everything's smooth and closed off. We're not seeing external gills. We do see that big spiracle, right? The opening that kind of forces water through. And all the rest is on the underside. That usually tells us the difference between our sharks versus our rays. In fact, a lot of the time you'll see these animals labeled as like saw sharks. Again, a common name. But if the gills are on the underside and we have that inferior mouth placement, that tells us immediately that, hey, some alarm should be going off in my head. This isn't a shark, it's a ray. Gills on the underside, big spiracle to move water through, more than likely a benthic dwelling organism. There's a lot of kind of minor or subtle, I guess, red flags that should be going off. So let's get into the rayiforms, the skates. Appearance-wise, again, it kind of depends on your experience with these animals. There are a couple things that immediately stand out, most notably here. The ability to do what we call punting, which I'll show you in a second, definitely comes into play. Again, I don't even want to say this really. Usually they're more triangular in form, but that's kind of like saying you can tell the difference from an alligator to a crocodile by the snout. Like, it's very up for interpretation and I guess a loose definition. Yes, they have a more triangular form, but that doesn't always mean that you can look at one and immediately know whether it's a ray or a skate. With all of these animals, you're going to have gill slits located on the ventral aspect, so the underside. We've got, again, a term hopefully you guys are all familiar with, dorsoventrally flattened animal, meaning pancake-ish. Uh, 5 gill slits, sometimes 6 on a few species, but they're always going to be on that ventral aspect. Fin-wise, we differ from sharks. Anal fins across the board, which are the last tiny pair on the ventral aspect of your sharks. Those have disappeared. And again, this is weird to think about, but really all that's happened is the fins have been just like you'd use a rolling pin at home to flatten out like a pizza dough or whatever you're making. It's taking a shark and flattening it out. Dorsal and pectoral fins have both developed into that iconic wing. And so, yeah, you're looking at a very flat shark. With the mouth placement, here comes one of the weirdest adaptations out there. And this is, again, guys, I'm not trying to dog on any of your skeletons. You can like your skeleton. But not having true bones and using cartilage and water buoyancy does have its advantages. And one of those comes with the palatoquadrate cartilage. This is how an animal, like, see, yeah, let's go back one for a second. You got to picture an animal that looks like this. Doesn't look very formidable as far as a predator. How is that mouth actually going to consume and tear apart and crush prey? Well, millions of years later, we get palatoquadrate cartilage. This is where, because you don't have a true, you do have a cranium, it's made out of cartilage, but because of that, you're not limited by the fact that bones have to be fused together. And we get this interesting setup. This is where essentially the jaws are able to extrude or protrude, whatever word you want to use, from the head itself. And it works in a couple ways. First off, and we'll see an image of it later, but in your mind's eye, picture that iconic great white shark at the side of a boat coming up to bite, and you see what looked like a shark turn into a horror movie where you've got the jaws protruding, all of these teeth coming forward, latching on to whatever poor victim has been fed out. But the jaws move almost independently of one another. They're not fused or attached to the skull in the same way that, let's say, it would be for us. Basically, what you have here, trying to think with this online format, what the best mental imagery for you is. Picture, again, hopefully this isn't, if this isn't an experience you know about, that's your homework assignment. Please go out and do this. If any of you ever set up a mousetrap before, like the old school, not the new stuff that's like plastic and it auto opens and you pinch it down and things like that. I'm talking the old school mousetrap that you have to fold open and put the bar over it. It's very scary. Everybody knows that it's going to go off the first couple times and pinch you. But hopefully you're familiar with that idea. Picture setting that mousetrap like the jaws of a Chondrichthyes. Now, instead of, if I want to hunt, and let's say I'm eating my mouse prey today, normally I would set the mousetrap down. When the animal comes up, obviously we all know what happens with the mousetrap. It snaps shut. That's how a typical jaw would work. With palatoquadrate cartilage, it's like taking the mousetrap, setting it, and then throwing it at the mouse. The trap itself snaps down independent, really, of the rest of the body, which provides us with a couple cool advantages here and some kind of unthought of positives to this model. When the mousetrap, in this case the jaws, are thrown, first it allows the mouth to extend outside of what the body should be able to do. Again, look at this picture. You're basically only going to be able to eat something that's flat and against the mouth. Not so with palatoquadrate cartilage. Now this whole part can extend forward. If you picture, it made its rounds a while ago. I haven't seen it recently, but maybe a lot of you have seen the videos of the goblin shark, an animal that lives pretty deep, but the jaws protrude almost offensively forward and clearly extend out past the cranium. Here we have a more subtle version, but this entire portion is able to extend outside of the body, collapse in and grab prey, and then do all the crushing, chewing, and bringing it back in. So good advantage there for our benthic species. When we get larger, let's move on now to great white sharks. The palatal-quadrate cartilage, as it protrudes from the mouth, again, if we're throwing the mousetrap now, the power that you can exert isn't felt by the rest of the body. And this is another big kind of overlooked advantage. You picture, again, like let's do great white sharks at Shark Week. You picture the force and the ferocity at which, in the way these animals attack. You're possibly breaching, flying out of the water, catching a huge elephant seal, something like that. There's so much violence involved that without a skull, you're really kind of risking a lot. You look at, certainly in the news lately, a lot of like football players and CTE and things like that, and basically the equivalent of a concussion, and the brain rattling around so much. It's very unwise to bite and hold on to prey that sometimes is even bigger than yourself. You're in for a lot of injuries. Certainly the brain's going to basically get rattled around, and it's not housed by a true skull. So there's some risk with it. We eliminate a lot of that risk if we can throw the proverbial mousetrap. When the jaws are able to protrude and bite down, they're almost acting independently. It's not affecting the rest of the skeleton. It's almost doing its own thing until the palatal-quadrate cartilage pulls the jaw itself back into the mouth. Does that make sense to everybody? I know we've used a lot of weird analogies. Does that make sense? It's the jaws, when they're out and tackling large-bodied prey, work almost independently of the rest of the skeleton. There's not a lot of the impact by the jaws is not felt throughout the rest of the body. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. With another great identifier outside of just the way these animals reproduce, we do have some, I guess, unique and borderline cute locomotion. Gosh, this online format's so hard because we can't just do spirit fingers in class or the wave. With the skates themselves, guitarfish are on here, wedgefish are included in this group as well. Basically, we have, I think the best analogy is just spirit fingers. They'll locomote by starting a wave, just like you'd see at a stadium. It starts in the front, and then we have spirit fingers the whole way down, only on the exterior edge. Basically, this part remains motionless. So this internal part, closer to the center of the body, it's the frills or the fringes of the fins or rays that are going to be moving forward. They do the spirit finger wave, and it ripples all throughout the body. Skates are the only group too that's going to exhibit punting. Punting is when they have these developed pelvic fins, and maybe you've seen a video. If not, you're certainly welcome to watch one after this. They skip along the bottom. They work like, and there's no word to describe it other than skipping. They hop forward, one cute little pelvic fin move at a time, and it looks like they're playing a game of hopscotch. They'll cruise along the bottom. Usually we see that filamentous waving behavior exhibited as well, but they're able to punt along the bottom. Again, more differences. This stuff is here for your edification. It's certainly not like, it's not I don't feel like it's test worthy because it's still very hard to visualize and immediately detect uh, the differences between skate and ray. You really have to know your stuff, and seeing them in action and seeing them live offers you a lot more than just, hey, here's this still image. What animal are we looking at? There's so many subtle behavioral patterns, locomotion, again, way that they're going to reproduce. A lot of the biology goes into it, much more than just what meets the eye. With the myliobatiforms, this is easily the most represented group. Um, Again, another great example. I think you guys are seeing a pattern at this point of what was a wastebasket taxa. Um, they were formally included with the skates. We went back in, did our research, and separated them out so that skates are clearly sitting on their own, especially with the way they reproduce. And now the new group has stingrays, eagle rays, and manta rays. Easily the most well represented grouping of Chondrichthyes in your typical Aquarius setting. Um, Not a lot of places have manta rays, but your stingrays are very, very popular, both in touch tanks and just exhibits in general. Um, yeah, just we know more about it because they're more prevalent in captivity. So of course that's going to give us the best research from it. Manta rays highlighted here because obviously they're the odd ray out. Um, and we discussed it earlier. Unique in the fact that we have all these benthic dwelling, smaller bodied animals that feed on crustaceans and polychaetes and worms and things like that at the bottom of the ocean. And then, of course, the biggest one in the group is this giant, peaceful, platonic filter feeder. The venom, or the a lot of people have called it a stinger. I've heard that. Presence on the tail. This is always a weird topic for me to discuss. I feel like it's been very blown out of proportion thanks to the tragic instances that occurred with my boy Steve. Uh, we all know how that story ended. If to highlight, at least nowadays, we have the opportunity to shed some better light on that. Uh, yeah, I can feel you guys all through the screen. Like, throw one up for my boy. That's my homie right there. His new grandkid looks very happy though and well taken care of. He's basically being raised in the zoo, so there's at least a silver lining on what Steve was able to teach us outside of just that. Um, the spine typically that was a freak occurrence. It really it shouldn't happen the way that my boy Steve got taken down. It's venomous to a degree. Without getting into all the details of it, it certainly wasn't the venom from a ray that wound up costing us one of the greatest advocates for animal care in the world. It was long story. It's the physical makeup of the barb that actually caused a lot of the complications that happened. But the spine is there. Yes, and somebody just in the chat was talking about inviting that stingray up with them as soon as that stingray passed. You know Steve did with open arms. Probably gave a really cool speech about it. So yeah, unfortunate, but that's not how the spine for their tail is really supposed to operate. That was just, like I said, kind of a freak occurrence. It's really not used much in predation or to attack. It's occasionally used to right itself, kind of like a horseshoe crab would, and then very much a defensive mechanism that really shouldn't affect humans that much. In a few species it does, but like I said, very misleading representation of how the tail is used. Again, we know that they're ovoviviparous or aplacental connection here, where appearance of live birth. And then the biggest thing, like I said, so much of this relies on you observing these animals in the wild. Here we have almost, I guess, a bird-like style of flying. Back on the skates, we saw the finger-like movements along the edges of the frills. Here we have true bird-like, like an eagle taking off. The entire pectoral fins or wings, if you will, these animals basically flap along the seafloor. Again, more subtle differences, images that are here to help you, especially if you want to go into this field. Not necessarily something, though, I'd consider like a make or break. These animals are typically covered with substrate and sand. So a lot of these details are tough to spot unless you really know what you're doing. Form of locomotion, method of reproduction, those are the two big ones we're looking at. As far as sizes, again, manta rays, of course, dwarf everything. You're talking a 30-foot animal. I want to say like harmless. Yes, you can swim with them. Yes, you can have a lot of diving encounters. Of course, that comes with the caveat of, hey, it's still the ocean. It's still a wild animal. It doesn't mean that you can just go ride on one. But just like whale sharks, they certainly exhibit a more peaceful nature than a lot of your typical rays. Your largest skate pales in comparison to the manta ray. You're talking 8 or 9 feet, but very long-lived for the most part. That seems to be a common theme with a lot of your skates. Skate on the bottom, just for reference. With the size disparity, small doesn't always mean weaker. A lot of your smaller rays have a new advantage with their electrical components, which certainly makes them very formidable. Skates, on the other hand, they just get small. There's not a lot of adaptations they have. Hopefully from this, you can see all the, I guess, differences or the disparity between, hey, this is why you can't just look at an animal and identify stuff. We've got additional fins, sometimes fins that rise up. A lot of people think skates and rays are just completely flat. So yeah, there's a lot going on. But again, without seeing these animals in person moving, there's no easy blanket statement to tell a skate from a ray. An entire list of all the differences. I mean, you can see from these two slides alone how much really goes into all the differences. It's just something that until you get into the marine biology field isn't necessarily going to impact you as a keeper going forward, but you have this here as a resource if you do need it. Torpediniforms, we're going to talk about really quick. Again, I've seen 2, I think, maybe 3, at least 2 in my time traveling to different facilities. These are your electric rays. They're said to be on par with kind of a hair dryer or a toaster going into a bathtub. So it's no joke as far as the shock these animals can put off. They're going to use what we call batteries. It's the 2 images you see here at the top of your screen. They have a really interesting history with humans. They were used quite a bit for medicinal purposes. It was taught that they would cure headaches. I've read before that it was used to teach or treat arthritis, any kind of mental disorder, so dementia, anything like that. You basically stepped on an electric ray and bam, you were cured. Obviously that doesn't work. Please don't try it. Definitely not something I advocate the usage of. That electroshock therapy hasn't been traditionally successful with human medicine. That didn't stop us from using it, though. Real quick, one of the things I want to highlight and point out here, the way that they were used with ancient Greek and Roman cultures, you have a electric ray in a tank or a bathtub type thing, and people would basically step on it. That would, of course, charge the water, the aqueous environment, but you're never going to receive the same kind of shock. Whereas that might have been, it's certainly not pleasant, I would imagine. I haven't done a lot of electric ray stepping. But the design of the batteries and the way that torpedo forms are supposed to work is they encapsulate and go over something. You're supposed to be underneath the animal and then caught in this transfer of currents between both sides. Does that make sense? The design is not to electrocute the environment; it's to really electrocute whatever's underneath the animal. So, while not lethal to humans, typically you could be in some real danger if you were to say be walking along an aqueous body and get your foot stuck underneath the animals. The shock there is much more intense and deliberate and focused than it would be, say, stepping on top of the animal. Um, I don't recommend doing it either way, but just know that the way the batteries are designed is for something to be kind of caught in the crossfire on the underside of the animal after it's enveloped it. Sawfish, really misunderstood animal, is certainly a great draw for guests at a facility. They get a lot of visitors, a lot of comments. They are really cool. All the kind of scary aspects of these animals are really very subtly used. They're not these apex mega predators. They're very efficient, but really the saw aspect that we see here in the image is used kind of like antenna. They are typically going to cruise around the bottom. They basically sweep that back and forth, almost like a human metal detector, except they're looking for worms, stirring up fish, crustaceans, things like that. Uh, they can be used as a weapon, but let's think about it. Efficiency wise, uh, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You can see where the mouth placement is. It doesn't make sense to impale a fish 6 feet away from you and then hope that you could eat it. Uh, Basically, this would be like just, I don't know, eating without your hands and pretending you could wipe your face afterwards. Um, it's much more useful as a sweeper that goes in front. They'll spend their time in a benthic environment, churning up the sand, using this again almost like an antennae, reaching out and stirring up, hopefully, something they can consume. That hopefully puts into perspective how big your manta rays get versus everything else. Really cool image. And now that moves us on to sharks. We're going to take a break right here. We'll have sharks pop up as a separate lecture, another video to follow up. But we're going to take a quick break here, and then we will get going again with the shark.